We're back again for another technical tutorial, and this two-part series will be closing out this first 8-week block. I certainly hope that you've learned something new and have maybe even been able to apply a couple of these concepts to your own music. Now, this week, we're going to be talking about something that's a little bit more conceptual, and as you see there with the third bullet point, the core concepts here are actually more important than the examples, mainly because you may not be able to hear all of the detail, the subtlety, and the nuance with these techniques or with this concept that I just lump into this broad category of color and character. So these are words you oftentimes hear associated with things like analog modeled plugins. We're going to strip that back a little bit and just try to focus on what's important, what the distinctions are, and then hopefully maybe even hearing a little bit of that nuance. It's very useful if you have golden ears, which just means that you've spent a lot of time in a mixing studio or a mastering studio. I don't have golden ears. Most of my music experience comes in the form of production, so actually making tracks, and I leave the details to people who have the golden ears, who have that experience. But these ideas are still very important, even on a broader level beyond just mixing or mastering, especially now where as a computer musician and electronic musician, you're normally required and expected to do all of the tasks yourself, so from sketching out the song to bouncing out the final master. So our main goal in this two-part series is to distinguish between distortion, saturation, color, and character when it's possible. In some cases, you really can't distinguish that much between distortion and saturation, and we'll talk about that and how you might want to try to look at those ideas moving forward. The DAW examples will be on virtual overdrive. So if you think about regular overdrive, that would just mean with an actual amplifier, so getting it to overdrive. But in the computer, oftentimes this is modeled, and so it's not real. You're not actually overdriving anything. You're just forcing the algorithm to think that it's being overdriven, and then what is the result of that? In the real world, that usually means a particular type or form of distortion. In plugins, it can be a little bit different. So we'll be talking and focusing a lot this week on the virtual overdrive, and then, of course, the varying degrees of distortion and saturation you can get out of overdriving these virtual amplifiers and other software models that you find in many plugins nowadays. All right, for the first time ever, we have a little bit of required reading. So I recommend that you do pause this presentation and you click on the link that's in the text. And the reading is very short. You just have to read the first couple of paragraphs up to the big girls don't cry major heading. If you want to read the rest, feel free. Some of the techniques and things that Jack Joseph Puig is going to be talking about are somewhat outdated, and he himself would probably admit that they're somewhat outdated, and for achieving particular sounds, he probably does things a little bit differently. So this article comes from Sound on Sound, Secrets of the Mix Engineers, the Jack Joseph Puig interview. All right, so go ahead, pause, take a quick look at that, and then we'll jump back and talk about the main points and why this may or may not be relevant to us. And of course, I'm sure you know it will be relevant. Otherwise, I wouldn't be asking you to do the reading. The main argument, at least as far as I can tell, this is my interpretation. Feel free to disagree if you want and set me straight in the comments. But I think what he's trying to say is that every device you have, so whether that's hardware or software, plugins or an analog EQ, the mixing board, the tape, everything put together, each of those in isolation is really just a color on the palette, or one color colored pencil in the large colored pencil book. And most of us only need a 16 or 24 set of colored pencils. And as you saw from that picture on there, this guy obviously has gone with the 256 set, that you're kind of jealous of as a kid when you're in art class and, your parents have given you the really cheap pack of 12 Crayolas. And then there's that guy across the way who's got this huge thing of colored pencils, every color known to mankind. That being said, the point is you can still accomplish a lot as long as you know and understand the colors that you have. And I think what then he's trying to say is that anyone can have a full palette. Anybody could walk into his studio, but not everyone is really an artist. Not everyone understands how to make those combinations work. And that's why an artist themselves, when they're getting colors, it's often a mixing process. And I think he's trying to equate it in the same way. So the question that I think you should have at this point, and if you're a little bit skeptical like me, the question you'd want to ask is he just trying to justify his fees? Is he trying to put this out here to say, look, I know what I'm doing. Look at all the work I do. Look at all this gear I have. Clearly, I know what's going on and I can achieve any sound that I want. And by extension, then, is he also trying to intimidate possibly an amateur mix engineer or even intimidate clients who might be considering going and hiring somebody a little bit cheaper? Or is he really onto something? Is what he's saying have merit? Is what he's saying true? And I'll leave it up to you to answer the question. He seems like a really nice guy. I've watched a couple minutes of some other videos where he's talked about some of these concepts, and I think for the most part, he really is trying to help, and this really is what he believes. But at the same time, you do need to approach everything with a little grain of salt and a little skepticism, because certainly you don't need all the stuff that he has to put out a fantastic record. There have been many people who have put out phenomenal records with much less. And then the other question we have here is his thought process relevant to the amateur, relevant to you, whether you're an amateur or a professional music creator. And I'm talking specifically about people who make music beyond just the mix engineer. Are his ideas, is his philosophy, is it actually relevant to you? Why or why not? The major takeaways from the last question I just posed to you in the previous slide is Jack Joseph Puig's thought process, is his approach to gear and colors and shades, is that relevant to the amateur, professional, modern music creator, whether that's a producer, a mix engineer, or probably if you're like me or like most people, you're required to do it all. You're more in a blurred role, especially if this is music that you're making for fun, the music that you want to do. And I would actually argue his approach is more relevant to the modern music producer than it is to, say, the dedicated mix engineer, mainly because there's so much more that's required of you, and it's just a question of when are you going to achieve that sound. So if you think about all of your samples in a production, let's say that you're working on some kind of hip-hop beat, and you're using a sample from this sample pack, another sample from this other sample pack, you've got something from freesound.org, you're using some kind of bundled built-in samples from your DAW, and they're all coming together in this smorgasbord. Sometimes it works great, and it doesn't seem like anything is missing. They just fit perfectly like pieces of a puzzle. But more often than not, these samples have all gone through such different forms of processing from it to get from that sample pack into your DAW, and specifically how it even got into that sample pack in the first place, meaning did this get run through any sort of analog gear? Was there any processing in the DAW? What was being used? And they normally don't tell you that unless it's a bragging point of that sample pack. Like, this is all run through a Studer tape machine. Okay, I'm going to buy the sample pack because of that. Well, no, I'm not going to buy the sample pack because of that. It's still about the samples and the sounds that are on there. But when you bring that in with something that's purely raw and digital, will they work together? And we get samples from all over the place on any given production. I try to stick to, especially with drum sounds, things from the same sample pack, but that's not always possible. And sometimes the track calls for things from all over the place. But what's really tying those together? They all have different, and here's the key, they all have different colors. They all have different shades. Even if it's the same kick drum from an 808 machine, there are hundreds of sample packs that feature 808 kick drums, but they all sound very different because they've all been processed differently. They all now have this new timbre, this new color, this new shade, and it's about trying to get those combinations to actually work. And we can take it a step further. Think about all of the multi-sample libraries that are on the market today for something like Contact. There are at least 100 pianos, and some pianos will sound very bright, very poppy. Others will sound very dark, very gloomy, maybe more for kind of like slow R&B track, right? Some sound a little bit more jazzy. And you can definitely hear the difference between that really bright piano and that dark, gloomy piano. So what are you going to pick? What color piano piano works best for you in the production. And same thing can be said for software synthesizers also. The tone of Massive, which was a very popular synthesizer for a very long time, is totally different to the sound of Diva. Both follow the same subtractive principle on how sound is created, but the tone, the quality, the color, the shade of these synths sounds completely different. And so you might want to use Massive in this instance, or you might want to use Diva in this other instance. It all depends on what you're creating. Now, I will say that this is why I think it's probably more relevant to the music producer than it is to the mix engineer. Distinguishing tone with mixing plugins requires you to have very golden ears. You really have to be able to hear the subtleties and the nuances of all of the processors that you have. And in some cases, especially with plugins and these modeling plugins, they may not model every single aspect of the device. So that little color, that little character of just bringing it on, sometimes it hasn't been modeled, so things don't sound different at all, or if they do, it's so small that nobody could really pick out one version versus the other, especially not the average listener. Speaking of the subtleties, how do most people enjoy their music? How is the average consumer listening to music today? Typically, they're getting a compressed file type, so something like an MP3 or an MP4 that's usually been limited pretty aggressively to make sure that it's loud enough to be heard over background noise, especially the major main parts of the song. Typically on headphones, not always, but mostly, and then normally in noisy environments. So whether you're walking down the sidewalk in a city, you're in the car, you're on a bus, you're on a metro, you're on a train, that's when a lot of people tend to get their music fix. And because of that, you cannot hear the subtleties. You cannot hear the nuance. And I can give you an example today. I was driving in the car. A song came on, going to the grocery store, and I'm listening to this song. I'm like, okay, this is an okay track. I can't hear any detail in it, but I like the way it sounds. I come back from the grocery store, park the car, and just at that moment, the same song comes on. And now with all of that background noise removed, I'm able to hear a little bit more of the detail, some of the nuance, some of the delay throws. I can actually pick out the reverb. I'm getting more of a sense of depth and space. But the question is, how many listeners, the casual average listener, are actually picking up on that? And does it make a difference? That's the $1 million question here. So the question I ask is, will the subtlety of EQ choice, just if I use this stock EQ versus this great analog modeled EQ, will that come through in the car over the radio when you're driving with a lot of background noise? I would say no, it will not. And in that case, the rough mix is actually really important. So getting those balances set the way you want them set is what makes a bigger difference. And we can even use Fergie's Big Girls Don't Cry, right? I've heard this song on the radio, and I've also heard lossless versions of it on pretty good playback systems. And there's a huge difference with the detail. And that's when you can really then appreciate Jack Joseph Puig's mix of the song, is when you're able to hear it in that really clean, nice environment. But most people, most listeners are not getting that same experience. Is it subconsciously rubbing off on them? He would certainly argue yes. I'm still on the fence about that. So it's definitely an issue that's ongoing, and I'd love people's thoughts on that. And of course, that being said, now our focus for the majority of this tutorial, but really the next tutorial, is going to be on the subtleties. And the reason why we're focusing so much on the subtleties is because I think you can obviously hear the difference with your primary elements. So with your different sample packs, your different multi-sampled libraries, and your different software or hardware synthesizers, you can definitely tell the differences, and you start to maybe lean to one for this application or lean to the other for another. And in my opinion, it's actually these decisions that are much more important to the overall vibe and quality of your sound. You know, the EQs you're choosing, the subtle bits of saturation or distortion that you're getting. Does it matter? I think it does matter, especially for the more critical listener, but it's not going to make or break a number one hit for you by any stretch of the imagination. I know some people will argue otherwise, but I've seen too many things. I've listened to too much music to a point where I know that in some cases, songs that turn out to be hits are not being run through the Jack Joseph Puig color model, and they still turn out just fine. Analog versus digital. If I had a nickel for every time that phrase has been written on the internet, I would have myself a lot of nickels. And we're not here to be a part of the debate. I'm not going to tell you that an analog signal flow is going to sound worlds better than a digital signal flow, mainly because I don't believe it, but also because it's not that relevant to most of us. The majority of us are not fortunate enough or lucky enough to work in a studio with a lot of analog gear, so we have to work within the confines of the computer in the software domain, and that's really what we're going to be doing. But it is helpful to just make some distinctions here and understand what analog digital really means. Analog is hardware without computer chips, so everything that's going on in there has a purpose, has a very physical purpose. You could look in there and say, I know what this part does. This part corresponds to this. This corresponds to the filter. This corresponds to the oscillator. This is how it was designed. This is how it was made. I have an analog synthesizer sitting next to me that I have opened up before, and I've seen all of the guts in there. There is a lot going on inside of this analog synthesizer. But when we go to digital, what we're really talking about now is either software, so plugins, or hardware that has some kind of CPU, some kind of computer chips built in that are really responsible for the sound that comes out. So for example, I have an Access Virus synthesizer sitting next to me on my right, and I've opened that up, and inside of that, really just computer chips. That's what's responsible for the sound. Yes, there are hardware knobs, but that's just controlling and telling the computer what to do. So just because it's hardware, that doesn't make it analog. It's still a digital device, albeit it has an analog power supply and it has some knobs on the top that, are tangible and make you feel like it's actually an analog synthesizer. Hybrids, these are rare, but they do exist, especially with new stuff that comes out. The bulk of it tends to be analog, then with the computer chip responsible for things like the preset selection and, things of that nature, making it easier for you to connect something to the computer and so forth. And so hybrids do exist, especially in the modern day, but usually they're prefaced as being mostly analog with just a digital component thrown in here and there. When it comes to analog versus digital and this big debate of what sounds better, what is better, I tend to think that people are going to go with what they prefer and what they're used to. I'm actually very used to making music and listening to music in the computer, listening to audio files, compressed waveforms. And you know what? I like it. I'm used to it. I have no problems with it. People who grew up on analog will tend to disagree because that's what they're used to. That's what they prefer. And if they did exist and were a part of the music production community or the music industry at the time of the transition to digital, I'm sure they hated digital because it sounds really harsh and kind of overly aggressive because nobody knew how to work with it and how to handle it. Now everybody knows how to do that. So I think the analog versus digital in terms of fidelity is something that just needs to go out the window because it's not that important of a debate. Average listener doesn't care about whether this is analog or digital. What they care about is the sound and if it's something that moves them. So one isn't better than the other, just different aesthetics. And I'm sure in 30 or 40 years, there'll be some new revolution in the audio industry that will take the world by storm. And then people like me who've grown up used to this digital aesthetic will probably reject it. That's just the way that these things go. And I'm sure will continue to go in the future. So our approach, no surprise, everything has to be entirely digital. But when we say entirely digital, this doesn't mean that we still can't get a lot of color or character from plugins. It's just accomplished via different means. So instead of it being analog circuitry and components, it tends to be algorithmic modeling. Okay, so a model of an amplifier, a model of an oscillator, etc. Some of the subtleties cannot be modeled or are not modeled with every single plugin that you get, which is something you need to be intimately aware of when you use certain analog modeled plugins and or you hear people debate the accuracy of certain emulations. So they'll say, oh, this Pultec sounds nothing like the actual hardware unit. And yeah, it probably doesn't because what has been modeled? That is always the question. It's never a case of one being better or worse than the other. It's just the sound is different because certain things have been modeled in certain ways. In some cases, software manufacturers, plugin manufacturers prefer trying to eliminate some of the imperfections and focus on different things like getting the curve correct. That's something we'll talk about next week when we get into character. Others will be more concerned with getting the amplifier stage right, so making sure that the color of the device comes through or how it is overdriven, make sure that they get that correct. But there's a lot of different features and a lot of different components that have to come together to create what's really uncreatable, which is the perfect emulation. And perfection in emulation is never something that you should concern yourself with too much unless it's exactly what you need, because this isn't about accuracy, it's about sound. It's about understanding the devices you do have, the sound and character of those, and how they can be used in your music. So that's our approach. That's really important. That's kind of fundamental to these next 2 weeks, is getting the idea that it's not about accuracy. It's about the sound. It's about you distinguishing those differences and finding what you actually prefer, what you think sounds the best and what works the best for your productions. Okay, this is going to be a little bit controversial, but it's not meant to be. I'm putting my hands up at the beginning. I'm trying to cover all my bases. When we talk about distortion, okay, so there's something that I'm sure all of you link the word distortion to when it comes to music production. But a standard definition of distortion beyond the realm of music production is really just a lack of clarity, a removal of clarity. And so for our purposes, again, specify for our purposes, and you know how I feel about definitions in general, so this is only the definition you need to apply for the next 2 weeks. For our purposes, any component, any aspect of the signal flow that does not play back the signal perfectly can be equated to a form of distortion. So even a flanger, even a chorus, even just the most basic of filter that may be quote unquote cleaning the sound is technically a distortion because it is changing the original in some way. Is it degrading the quality? Not necessarily. That would normally be the way that we would define distortion, but for our purposes, that is irrelevant. So basically, with our definition, everything in the signal flow, either analog or digital, either analog emulated, software emulations, or digital, as clean as possible, will be some kind of distortion because virtually everything you put on is designed to affect or change a sound in some way. Even a very clean compressor, assuming that it's doing some form of gain reduction, it's degrading that signal, it's changing that signal, and therefore for our purposes, we need to define that as distortion so that we understand everything moving forward. The major exception, and this is the biggie, especially for what comes in, right, to the DAW, for example, analog faders, analog channels, and an analog console itself, as compared to the DAW's faders and channels. The DAW will play back whatever you give it as cleanly and precisely as it possibly can. Running through a console will not necessarily do that. So that is the real big major distinction. If you have your track and you use a tool device to turn things up or down, you're really not changing that signal unless you turn things up way too much. It's still the same thing, just maybe slightly louder or quieter, but you haven't changed anything about that signal apart from the bass volume level. Very important idea to grasp and to understand. It's central to everything else we're going to be talking about, and especially next week. So for the next couple of weeks, think about distortion as just anything that changes the signal. On now to the major idea of week 1, which is the virtual overdrive. Overdrive in general equals more than just color. So when you overdrive an amplifier, that's when you start to audibly hear that distortion. And that's when you'd say, okay, we are now coloring the sound. But along with just that color, we usually also get some form of compression because you have overdriven the amplifier circuit. And by doing that, it is clamping down. That's the whole point. You've gone beyond the realm of no return. You've pushed it past its technical limits, and energy cannot be destroyed out of nowhere, so it has to do something, and that reaction is oftentimes a pretty aggressive form of compression. However, the color, what we're more focused on here, is actually achieved by adding additional frequencies. So when the energy exceeds that threshold of clean playback, something is added in, and that something are additional frequencies. So we'll be looking at a variety of different examples in the DAW lab portion, which is going to happen right after this slide. We'll look at digital distortion and then a variety of different analog modeled situations and what happens when we drive things over their limits. That's what overdrive means, beyond its limits. So we can go from a subtle type of analog distortion to something that's very much intentional to something that's extreme. So with subtle, it would be like very gently overdriving tape, going into a virtual console just in general and maybe going through that amplifier a little bit hot, EQs, compressors, all of these things that have amplifiers on the way in, amplifiers on the way out, we can distort. And we'll look at and talk about the signal flow that corresponds with that. Intentional types of distortion are things like stomp boxes, so guitar emulations where you have amplifiers that in their very nature are designed to distort. That's the point, to get that aggressive sound and a lot of extra color. And with extreme, we're just talking about heavy distortion, any type of distortion that's been gone. No, there's nothing as going too far, but it's gone beyond the realm of clarity. You cannot understand or decipher the original signal, or it's just barely there. We start to approach noise at that point when we really distort something so heavily that there's just so many frequencies all popping up that we have a tough time establishing or defining pitch or any kind of clarity. We can't figure out what the timbre of the instrument is. All we can hear is the timbre of the distortion. Of all the DAW lab sessions that you watch on this website, this may be the most technical. And when I say most technical, I mean you're going to watch this and go, oh, wow, I never really thought about that. Oh, that's really cool. I didn't know that. Good to know. But will you be able to apply these ideas practically? And I would say you can, but it's much harder to grasp that. And that's really the point of this video. So what you have to do is you have to spend a lot of time just thinking about these concepts. The more you think about these concepts, the more it will start to sink in, and the more avenues you'll find where you can actually use some of these techniques in your own music. So just because you watch it and you kind of get a cursory understanding of what I'm talking about, that would not really be a success in my book. You want to be thinking about it so you can figure out, how can I actually apply these to my music? Do I want to apply this strategy to my music? And or after you do, does it actually work? Is it accomplishing the point that I want it to accomplish? If you remember from a couple of slides ago, we did talk briefly about defining distortion. And for these 2 weeks, we're just defining distortion as any kind of change to the signal. And that will become really important next week. But what we're talking about here is what more so is classically defined as distortion. I'll be defining it as saturation. And that definition goes as such. Number one, we can actually see the harmonics, the partials that we're adding into the signal. We can look at it on a spectrum analyzer and we can see that something is being added based on how we are virtually overdriving whatever plugin that we have. Okay, or in some cases, the system itself with digital distortion and overdriving the DAW. So that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. That's not the way most people would describe that, but it's the same general concept, and you will see that as we go forward. And number two is that you can actually hear it. So this is very much theoretical. I want to make sure you can see it. I want to make sure you can hear it. But then in reality, when you're doing this to your actual sounds in a production, you'll probably be pulling back on this quite a little bit. And before we go any further, I just wanted to tell you one quick anecdote, because I think it's important to mention that a strategy like this, you can easily think this is the best way to break the mold, to avoid the plastic sound, right? A lot of people use massive. A lot of people will use, the built-in synthesizers with their DAW that don't have a particularly warm analog sound. So you say, okay, how do I accomplish that sound? How do I differentiate my plastic sounding synth from everyone else? I saturate it ever so slightly. And it's a strategy and it's a technique that I've been using for a long time. And it's something that I love to do. And I've always felt like, oh, this makes my sound so much warmer, so much more organic, whatever sort of corny adjective you want to use. And one day I was talking to Paul, the co-founder of the Sormena project, and we were talking about production strategies, and I was going on and on about saturation and, the balance of even and odd harmonics and how you can actually emphasize particular overtones to try to fit somebody's voice or fit other instruments going on in a production. And I'm just, ranting on. It might have been an email, I don't remember. But after that, and after I finished my long speech and, monologue, which I'm sure many of you wish I would just shut up sometimes, Paul responded back with something quite eloquent and simple. He goes, yeah, you clearly care a lot about saturation, and that seems to be your go-to. But for me, it's actually reverb. And I'm thinking to myself, what? No, reverb is used for depth. It's not used as a means to break the plastic mold. That has to be done with saturation. He goes, no, I spend a lot of time thinking about my reverb choices. I've gone through a ton of reverb plugins to find the ones that really work and suit the sound that I'm going for. And I spend a lot of time using that to kind of break the plastic mold. And I'm sitting there kind of in disbelief. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, he's absolutely right. Saturation is just one technique. That's just one way to look at effects processing. And the truth is, at least in professional music, when you go through a mixing stage and a mastering stage, a lot more of that saturation is being added in at different points in the chain. So what's the point of spending so much time on it in the production area when more is going to be added in? And you kind of know that will eventually help to break up that plastic sound. So something like reverb, especially short decay times, really getting the early reflections dialed in. What are early reflections? What is reverb? It's just a dense amount of delays, a bunch of delays stacked on top of each other. So not only is that going to add you width, but it's going to give you a unique coloring aspect as well. And the reason I tell you this is because you don't want to think about things so much in terms of black and white, and you don't just want to ever follow one person's strategy or their techniques that they use. Because for me, if I hadn't had that conversation with Paul, I'd probably be sitting here telling you, yeah, the best thing to do is use this saturation technique, and it absolutely isn't the best thing to do. Different strategies work well in different contexts, in different areas, and it's about doing what sounds right to you, what's comfortable for you. So always look beyond, always ask questions, and be willing to hear what other people have to say and other strategies and techniques. Because really, after talking to Paul and after spending several days really reflecting on what he said about using reverb to kind of break up that plastic sound, it's really changed my music production outlook and really my music productions moving forward, because I'm not always going to pull to the techniques and the saturation overdrive that we're going to be looking at here. Okay, so long monologue over. Now we'll get into the actual technical nitty gritty, which I'm sure you all just can't wait to get into. Our first type of virtual overdrive is when we overdrive the DAW itself. What kind of saturation can we expect to see inside of the digital domain? And as I'm sure many of you know, we are going to see digital distortion. We will see it and we will hear it. So how do you overdrive the DAW? It's very simple. You breach the 0 point. You breach the 0 dBFS mark and you start going over that 0. And once you do that, once you cross that threshold, you move into the digital distortion category. And it's just because the DAW doesn't know how to handle anything higher. This is all mathematics. You can always turn it up louder by just turning up your speakers. But inside of the DAW, there has to be some kind of a limit. It just has to exist that way with the numbers. So if I was to take this amplitude and I was to crank this all the way up, and we're starting with just a basic sine wave, as I crank this up and we cross the 0 threshold, we're going to start to see and hear digital distortion, and we'll look at that in just a second. But before we do that, here's an interesting trick question for you. What will happen if we go with our built-in tools, like we have here in the DAW, we take our tool device, we go plus 36, and then we compensate for it on the other end? What are we going to get? Let's keep trying this again. Maybe there's something wrong. No, nothing is wrong. This has to do with what I call the 32-bit miracle. So when you work, and I'm not going to go into the mathematics, I don't understand it, but most modern DAWs are now operating at what's called 32-bit floating point depth. Basically, this just means that you can distort anywhere along the signal flow as long as you're using the right sort of plugins, and you can compensate for it. You can bring it down afterwards and it will remove that distortion. And that's what's going on here, because we're clearly crossing the 0 point. And if you watch next time I pause it and I stop it, look how long it takes for this to come down. So we're going way over at this point, but we're not hearing any distortion. We can compensate for it. Is this the way you want to work inside of the DAW? Absolutely not. This is not a good habit. And the reason it's not a good habit is because most of your analog modeled plugins, and really just most plugins in general, don't operate by this same logic. They operate by if you are breaching a certain number here, it may not be 0, it could be lower than that. Once you go over that, saturation is starting to occur because it's emulating the actual behavior of a real world amplifier. That's what it's trying to do. Inside of the DAW, there is no real amplifier here. It's all numbers. So we can make up the difference at any point, especially in the 32-bit floating point world. Very cool little thing there. And I just wanted to touch on it because I wanted you to realize how things in the DAW work a little bit differently. But if I wasn't to compensate for this, and I just was to go in here and crank this all the way to the top, we could expect to get a ton of digital distortion. And I'll just go ahead here and I'll bounce this out so that we don't have to blow our eardrums out. We can even see when we go in and look at this that the waveform is going to look quite a bit different. This is our sine wave. We can see it shaped as such. This is our digital distortion file, and it's taken that sine wave and it's converted it into a square wave. It's just lopped off the tops of these things as it comes up, up, up. It breaches that threshold, and then it starts to just clamp down on it. So this is also why we talk about a compression element as well. It's a peak limiter, really, is what it's doing. It's not going to sound good, but it is limiting at the very top. It can't really go over 0. And if we were to play this back, you would see that this actually is coming out at exactly 0. Again, I don't want to blow your eardrums out, so I'm just going to turn it down by 12, and we'll see that it actually comes out at perfectly minus 12. So let's listen now to this digital distortion. And notice how it sounds quite a bit louder from this sine wave that's actually peaking out here at minus 8. All right, we could take this and even probably turn it down by 6 more, and we'll see that's peaking out at, minus 18. And it's still sounding louder. And when we bring the span device in and we look at it, we can see what's going on. Now, in this example, this is where things get a little bit confusing. Because we just have that singular sine wave there, you are seeing more of what I would call a harmonic series, okay? We have that 220, which is an A. And now the next little overtone or partial that's being generated is actually at that E5. It's at that perfect fifth from that A, that 220A, A, B, C, D, E. Okay, that's the fifth. And you can see it like so. And then we could expect to see, let's see, this is C sharp. And it's falling exactly where you would expect it. But that's not really the norm with digital distortion. And typically, if you do digitally distort, if you do clip a more complex signal, you won't have that kind of perfect clarity. And I can explain that to you here by using a bit crusher, okay? And this is doing what you would expect digital distortion to do, only you get control over it. So that's really the key. That's what makes digital distortion so much fun. And we don't actually have to overdrive the DAW like we did there. We had to go in, we had to drive that all the way to the top. And so here you have bits and you have clock. And so clock you can actually equate to the sampling rate. And if you see all the way at the top here, we're at 100K. So what does that actually mean? It means 100,000 hertz, I believe. That is way over anything that is required based on the Nyquist sampling theorem. That basically states that if we're going to sample any sort of waveform, create a digital file out of it, that needs to be 2 times the range of human hearing. That's why we record at 44.1, or why we would record at something like 48. 48's a little bit higher than is necessary. And so what this tells me is that I shouldn't really hear or see any kind of distortion. And I'm just going to delete this so that we don't accidentally blow our eardrums out. I shouldn't see any distortion until I get to below 44.1. And we can see as I start to drag down, Not hearing anything. Not hearing anything. Because we're still here at 65K. As I get to that 44.1, here it comes. Ah, there it goes. And this is more what I would expect from a digital type of distortion. We are getting all of these partials popping up at unexpected places. And then when you add in the jitter, all right, you start to get that element of randomness coming in. So true digital distortion that you can't really control. Obviously you can, and what's interesting is if I go and I set this to something like 440, for example, we will see a harmonic series. I'll show you that in a second, but I'm just going to keep pulling this down. And you can see that like so, but we still have control over this, obviously. We could even set a balance here with the mix. If I go in here and I put this to 440, for example, let's just turn this down. We start to see more of an expected harmonic series. But notice how it doesn't really fade off. It almost stays constant all the way across there. All right, so that's what we have in terms of sampling rate. There's also bit depth control here, and that's controlled with this quantization. The higher up we go, the more we're distorting the signal. And then you start to see what we get. And so when we combine the two, we really get what we expect from a digital distortion. And if we were to put the mix all the way to 100%, eventually what we just start to see is something closer to white noise. So I just am going to turn things down to compensate for that. So when we really do start to push things, you can see how there's no real control. There's no rhyme or reason to that. And when you use more complex signals than just a sine wave, it really then does start to show up. And clearly it's something that you can hear. But typically what we're going to expect beyond the realm of digital distortion is when we get into more what they refer to as analog distortion, which just means that it follows more of a harmonic series. There's a logic to it. And so it doesn't sound quite as harsh. And typically we say it sounds quite pleasing unless you push things really, really hard. So we have in here inside of this program, this built-in distortion device. And this works very simply. All I have to do is increase the drive. And now it's as if we are overdriving some kind of virtual amplifier, a real world amplifier. And we can expect the results to be as such. And let's do it the other way. Let's bring the mix up and then start to add in some drive. So right here, we're already starting to see something pop up. Okay, and then as I bring this in, we're starting to see more of a harmonic series. And however it decides to preface these harmonics is really what makes a difference between all of these distortions, all of these different saturations. That's what makes the difference. That's what you're listening for in an actual practical application beyond just the sine wave when you're listening to real sounds. That is what you're listening for. You can always bring it into a spectrum analyzer, but it doesn't make that much of a difference. And I don't want to go into details how certain amplifiers preface one or the other. No, just listen to it and start to get a feel for it. You probably don't have 800 different saturation devices, so it shouldn't be too hard. And then with this symmetry control here, we can actually adjust our balance of harmonics and even then start to bring in other harmonics, so we can start to bring in the even and the odd. And you can see that like such. And again, if we had a more complex signal, this would make a lot more sense. The slew control also is something that's going to control these harmonics and what is prefaced. So if you want something a little bit more subtle, that's the way that you can actually achieve that. And then this, if we were to use the slew control and bring it down by quite a bit, bring the drive down by quite a bit, This is more what you expect from overdriving something like a console, okay? Nothing too drastic. It would even be less than this probably. Really bring it down nice and low. And then if we could get a symmetry balance, and we're not driving enough to actually get a symmetry balance, but this would give you a better idea of what you expect from just slightly overdriving, say, tape or a console. It's not going to be too drastic or too extreme. If we then just get a mixed balance, you'll see why this makes sense in just a second when we look at a couple of other devices in here. Okay, the last thing that we'll look at with the sine wave, and then we'll move on to some other things, is actually with this EQ device here. And now the only way that you can actually get the saturation to show up with this is by adding gain at or around the frequencies that you want to add the saturation to. You'll see how this comes in a lot more handy when we get to the drum beat and some of the other sounds. But for now, I just want to actually get it so that you can see some of it showing up. So I need to bring this back down to 220. And I'll turn the auto gain on for right now so that it will turn things down as I bring this up. Right now, I do not have any saturation on. I'm just going to turn that up by 18. I'm even going to turn it down a little bit more on the output. Okay, and now I'm going to turn the saturation on. And once I do that, what makes this plugin so unique is that you control the amount of overdrive from this calibrate. So it's very different to the idea of overdriving some kind of an real-world amplifier. This is very unique. This is something that's very digital orientated. And I don't mean digital in a bad way. I just mean this is something that's more in line with like mathematics and a lot of user control as it is to emulating real-world analog hardware. So as I take this calibrate and I start to drive in, we begin to start seeing some of these harmonics pop up. And now if I take the output gain, I just bring that up, we'll start to see more and more in how this curve is actually working. Okay, something like that. And then we can go through and we can actually look at some of the other options that they have. So this is called linear. Silky, you can see how that changes. Mellow. Deep, again, this you'd hear a bigger difference on actual playback system, not just a sine wave. And then we have funky, which is the most aggressive, and this actually looks more like something that we saw with that distortion that we had working there. So a very cool plugin, a very interesting idea, an interesting way of approaching things, but something worth explaining and showing to you because this works a little bit differently than what you would normally expect. And what we're listening for in this lab is specifically what is being brought in. Nothing more and nothing less. Very important. Next week, we'll talk about the more nuanced stuff, but this is something that at least with analog modeling can be done pretty easily because you can take an actual amplifier, you can way overdrive it, you can study it, you can analyze what happens, and then you can try to model that. So that's not too difficult to do. Well, I mean, it would be for me, but for plugin manufacturers, it's not too hard. And just like that, you could see that they've developed different algorithms for the new harmonics and partials that are going to pop up. And you'll just have to listen to the variety of what you get. All right, cool. So that is out of the way. Let's move on to some actual musical sounds now. And we have here this drum loop. And with this drum loop, I want to start with just a variety of different effects here. These are very obvious and easy to hear, just a basic one knob control to add in saturation. And it's also here going to be adding in some form of compression. So let's actually turn this up so that we can see the difference. All right, I think I can have this play back normally. Cool, because eventually what I want you to see is the difference in waveforms so that you can see the compression behavior. Really, it's more of like a peak limiting as I bring this drive in. Okay, so you can see that we're peaking out at -7.3 with this off. peaking out at 3.4, so we're densing everything up. We're overdriving an amplifier, and this is what happens. Along with that compression that you get, that true dynamic range limiting, you also are getting these additional overtones, additional color being brought in. And you can see in the span how it does densen up. That's what I want you to be looking for. Now that we're away from that sine wave, you can see a little bit better what's kind of going on. All right, so watch how this kind of densens up. And then when we bounce this, you'll really be able to see the difference in waveform. Yeah, that's a massive, massive difference. So you can look in here and see these peaks and stuff and how they're very clean. Oops. And then we'll go and we'll look at the other audio file. Yeah, not quite so clean. Those peaks have really been cut down on, and this looks like what you would get from a very aggressive form of compression. Obviously here we want to get those additional artifacts. We want to bring those on as well. I actually have decided to change things up and skip ahead a little bit because this will provide a great comparison with what we just did with the overdrive so that you can start to understand really the difference between saturation and then what would be more like just a clean compression or a clean peak limiting. And a great plugin for that is this, actually designed more as like a mastering tool, but we can use it for a coloring device as well, which is this limiter number 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to only be working with the hard clipper here, or I guess maybe it's still designed to be a soft clipper. And then we also have this kind of final loudness peak control, which we'll look at in just a second. I'm turning this on just to save us from any digital distortion, but it's not going to be doing anything. It's not actually what's contributing to the gain reduction and the additional saturation that's brought in. So the difference between a clipper and like a very clean digital peak limiter is that the clipper is designed to add in a little bit of additional saturation. So we'll hear that here. All right, so we have our clipper going. We'll turn it on. We have a couple different modes. The multiband mode is very clean, but the normal mode is going to give us the real kind of heavy duty saturation that I want you to be able to hear. So let's just go ahead and set this up, start getting some saturation. Bring the threshold down. All right, we're finally starting to see a little bit something. As I bring this knee down, we'll get more and more aggressive with it. And now here's where we're going to start to get the saturation. I'm going to drive into it. So you can hear that like so. So really on the kick drum is where you're mostly hearing it. But if I go and I bounce this out, we will again see the gain reduction that's been applied, but there is still that extra color that's been brought in. So we can listen to the original version here, followed by the clipped version, followed by the driven version. And again, we are roughly at the same peak level. In fact, this peak level is brought way down, but it's going to sound very loud. And then we can compare it to something that's intended to be a little bit more clean sounding, okay? Something that's you really can only accomplish in the digital domain, and this is why software can be so powerful. I'll turn the clipper off, and now we're actually just going to be working with this guy here. So we have that digital ceiling. Okay, we'll say, sure, 0.2, 0.3, either way, and then we're just going to drive into this guy pretty hard. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the other meter, and now we're going to start to, again, notice, we are pegged out at more than 12 dB of gain reduction, but quality sounds almost exactly the same. It's just heavily compressed, heavily limited. Here we can see some movement. And I want to see a little bit of movement, okay? So that would be something that would be fine. And then I can bounce that. And again, we're going to see the result of it, and we can see what happens here with the peaks. They get chopped down on, but they do so in still a bit of a curvature. Compare that to this guy on the peaks, a little bit more squared out. And then here in this last example, almost completely squared out. All right, and we can listen to these 3 guys back to back. All right, so that's a pretty important lesson for you, at least in how these different processors are working. You want the saturation when you want that little bit extra color. People who more so work in EDM and pop music, you want to get it loud without adding a lot of additional color. So this is more like rock and roll. This is certainly more pop, or in some cases, the cleaner styles of EDM. Some EDM and some electronic music in general is all about saturation, in which case even something like this may be appropriate. So if you think back to the slides, you can remember that we talked about how certain effects are designed, certain amplifiers, I should say, are designed to be overdriven. That is their function, that is their purpose. And specifically what we're normally talking about are things like stomp boxes. And even in a lot of ways, this drive knob is designed to be distorted. Of course, we don't know what it is, what it's emulating. It could be something entirely unique that that company has thought up. But if we go in and then use something like, say, this stomp box, we're using it on a piano loop, but its whole intention, its whole purpose is to be overdriven. So even if we go in here with no drive and we just listen to this off and then on, even with very little input gain, we're still hearing that distortion. And the design of this amplifier, what's inside of here, the whole point is to have this thing be distorted. Now, we can get it pretty subtle. And we'd have to turn up the level on the output. So you can hear the tonal change that's happening. And we do have an additional tone control. And what this does, if you think back to what we looked at before with how on this distortion device, we had this symmetry control that kind of changed what harmonics were going to be emphasized. And you could adjust that and get kind of a balance as well with the slew control. That's what you can think of the tone control doing. It's probably both an EQ and has some kind of effect over the drive itself. That's probably not true with the hardware, but at least with this plugin, I'm pretty sure that's how it's working. So we can get most of then that distortion, the saturation happening in the high frequencies or in the low frequencies. But something like this is designed to be pushed hard. But what I want you to listen to and notice, this is very dynamic on purpose, a lot of loud and then a lot of soft. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. It has to do with compression and how this is actually being then limited. So if we listen, you can hear how there's more distortion at these louder bits. And if I bounce this out, we can look at it. And we'll kind of see the curves that are happening here on those louder hits, how it's definitely kind of de-peaked things just a little bit. You can see that peak there, very definite. That peak now really brought down compared to one of the quieter points. Here's kind of a peak here. And then we can go and we can look at the same thing. And you can see it hasn't changed the shape of that all that much. And this just has to do with the idea of overdriving an amplifier again. We come back to that again. If you have a signal that's very dynamic and only in the loud bits is it actually going over the threshold of that amplifier, what that amplifier can play back cleanly, only then will you get the distortion. If it's then very quiet later on, you're not going to get any distortion because it's back within the confines of what that amplifier can do. And a great another visual example of that. And we get a great little visual display of what's going on, and we can bring the distortion down way low. And you can can hear on those two piano parts, those two little hits, the quieter hits, how much less you're actually hearing of that distortion compared to the first two. Notice how here it actually square waves for a second. That's what we were talking about before with the really heavy distortion. That's what happens. Not as squarey. So that's an important concept that I want you to understand. Of course, you can still hear some of the saturation throughout, but when we start to get into a little bit of more, I don't know, not experimental, but into the more subtle forms of saturation by just overdriving amplifiers in, say, an EQ or in a compressor, it makes a difference if you have something that's quite dynamic, because only the loud things will actually add that additional saturation. So just something to be aware of. Now we move into what's a little bit more subtle, and that has to do with overdriving amplifiers that are actually meant to play back the signal cleanly. We just looked at amplifiers and overdriving amplifiers, at least virtually, that are designed for that purpose, something like the stomp box or a lot of the distortion effects that you find inside of your digital audio workstation. You would never expect that something like an EQ or a console EQ can be pushed and can be overdriven, and in a lot of ways that's actually the purpose of something like this. This is what I was talking about with adding that little bit extra special sauce to what otherwise might be more of a plastic sound. This can add a little bit of weight, and clearly if you push it hard enough, you will be able to audibly hear the saturation. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we have to try and really decipher what this VU means and what it stands for. Right now, if we listen back to this bass sound, we can see that at the loud portion, we do actually cross over that 0 point and get to a place where it's peaking way up at that 3. Are we digitally clipping? Let's check. No, we still have plenty of headroom here. So what is this telling us? What does it mean? And what does this mean for signal flow? Well, what it really is telling us is that when we go over 0, that is when we start to get into the realm of a saturation, some kind of analog saturation. In this case, this is modeling an Abbey Road's console, the red console. And I'm not sure if they took a lot of time to try to emulate that particular amplifier and what happens when it gets overdriven. But if they have, that's at least the ideal situation for using something like this. And even from here, you'll be able to hear a difference with this plugin turned on and off without us even touching anything, because it does drive over. All right, you can hear that if we turn it off and on. If you listen to the high end, you'll especially hear it. We can look at it with the span. Here it is off. And now with it on, I want you to look up here at this more 8K region. Yeah, see, something is definitely being brought in here. But if we were to turn this down at the input so that we don't go into the red at all, we keep it safe. I have to turn it down quite a bit, don't I? Yeah, and then we were to compensate for this with the output gain or with the additional tool device, we wouldn't be getting that saturation. And I could go and I could just use something like this, which is very clean on the output. And I could start to turn things up to compensate. And we would start to see that, yeah, even if we bring this way up, we're not adding any of that additional saturation in. So very important when you get analog modeled EQs that you experiment with this, or analog modeled compressors. Have they emulated the amplifier characteristics and what happens when you overdrive the amplifiers? And that's what we're going to be listening to here. So what we want to do is we want to use this VU meter as our guide, and we want to, at least going in, not have it too hot. So we can check it out here. This is on its way in. We'll use this color to determine that. We should have, usually these are set to -18. That's your reference point. And so we're coming in pretty hot. So Okay, so that's a little bit better. We then go into the plugin where we can push things pretty hard, and then we can just compensate for it on the way out. So the harder we push this, the more saturation we can expect. And a great thing to actually do, I'll just show you this quickly if you have something like this. If you have like macro controls, you can actually have this set up from the very beginning. So if I go in here and I open up the proper plugin window, I can just click on my input gain, and I have it in link mode, so that's very important. And I can have this drive in, and we'll set it to 0.5. And then what we'll do is we'll click the output, and I'm not sure if this is in its default state. Now it is, and we can bring that down by 0.5. So with one turn of a knob, we can actually get that difference. All right, so this is like gain staging with one knob turn. So you can hear the harder we push it, the more saturation we get. With the exception of it then going all the way to 0, it mutes it, but now we can be able to really hear and see the saturation that we've brought in. All the way up to the top there with it off. Right? So just wanted to show you that this would be more of a subtle way of doing things. This is to the extreme, but this is one of those techniques and applications that people use all the time to add a little bit extra color. And this is just having to do specifically with overdriving. It has nothing to do with the rest of the EQ at all. We're not using the rest of the EQ. We're only using the input and the output stages, and specifically the input stage to overdrive that virtual amplifier. For the sake of time, I'm actually having to very sadly cut a lot of things out of this video. I had even a lot more planned, but we'll go into our last example, which is a saturation that's really frequency dependent and frequency based. And this is much more unique to digital plugins, or something that's kind of being built from the ground up as compared to analog emulated. With analog emulated, we are emulating the characteristics of what happens when an actual amplifier gets pushed over, gets overdriven. But here inside of the TDR Voss Slick EQ, the saturation is actually based on the gain that is added to a particular area. So for example, if we wanted to hype the high end on this drum loop, okay, and that's really hyping it, but we want to take this even further, we could go in and we could then add in saturation, and it's only saturating based really here on this 10K and up. So let's actually bring this down and do something that would make a little bit more sense. Let's bring this to about 5K, use a shelf. So that already makes a pretty big difference, but now let's go in and let's like maybe apply the funky, and we're gonna really be able to brighten this up now. Turn it on. And then we'll turn the EQ off. And then we'll bring it back on. If we really want to push it, we can. And then if we really want to push the low end, we can turn this guy on. And you're really hearing the saturation to that kick drum. And then, of course, we could try out and mess with some of the other guys as well. So that gives you an idea, and this really starts to add up when you put it onto all sorts of different tracks, and it's something we talk about in the second course in the mixing portion there. So if you want some more information on how this is all working, you should certainly check that out. But again, this is designed to be a very subtle bit of saturation that's being brought in, and so hopefully now by going through all of these examples, you have a little bit of a better idea of how this is working and how we're technically defining saturation. Remember, this is just one aspect in defining color and character. There are other things that we will be talking about next week, but for now, you can just stick to the saturation. Think about that. Think about when this would and wouldn't be useful. And I have to state that by the end of doing these videos, and I've done these a few times, my ears completely are burnt out. So hearing the differences for me starts to become more and more difficult. Hopefully for you, you didn't have a problem with that. So I recommend experimenting away and seeing really the new sort of colors and overall vibes, the new timbres you can get just by using something like this, whether it's very extreme or very subtle. I think that we've run the whole gamut here in this DAW laboratory session. Just to recap, here are the main ideas from the previous DAW examples that we just looked at. Overtones or partials are added in with the original signal when you virtually overdrive whatever component is causing that distortion inside of that plugin. Typically, this is emulating the behavior of an analog amplifier, but not always. There are things that are unique, as you could see with like the Slick EQ, for example. Those are all just saturation models that I think are completely created by the individuals themselves. It's not necessarily modeling any kind of amplifier that we know of. It's something that they've created uniquely. Now, when you think about overtones, you normally want to associate that with the harmonic series, so some kind of analog distortion. When it's driven in, it's going to vibrate at something that's sympathetic to the harmonic series of that signal. When we talk about partials, these can either be harmonic or inharmonic. Something like digital distortion, you can't really control or guess where those new frequencies are going to be popping up at, but they do happen. So that would be the distinction between those two. So normally, this overdrive, this distortion, an audible distortion, is occurring because an amp is being overdriven. Remember that the first law of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, which just means that when an amplifier is pushed beyond its technical limits, so beyond the point where it can play back a signal cleanly, something has to happen. It can't just go away. There needs to be a cause and effect. And an effect is those additional partials coming through or those additional overtones coming through. And then a lot of times there's also a compression characteristic happening as well. So what I want you to really get out of this is that there is no reason to strictly define or distinguish the words distortion and saturation. This is just a matter of hearing and recognizing all the color options that you have. So if you want to use the word saturation to talk about things like more of a subtle overdrive of like a tape or of a console, that's totally fine. And if you want to use the word distortion to classify things like a stomp box or something really aggressive, by all means, be my guest. But trying to say that there is one perfect definition to distinguish distortion and saturation, it just doesn't exist, and it shouldn't exist, because this is about you hearing and really being able to identify the tools you have. So with whatever sort of saturation devices or distortion devices that you have, you really need to listen. That is what this all comes down to, listening and identifying the colors, the ways that all these different devices, all of these different plugins are unique and stand out from one another. And when you're able to do that, not only will you develop more of a better ear, you start to get to that golden ears category, but you also will then know what sort of pairings you want to use when you need a distortion effect or even something like a little subtle saturation effect. Final thoughts. The virtual overdrive comes in all shapes and sizes, as we just saw, and there are some that are entirely unique, like the TDR Slick EQ with the different types of distortion that you can use that aren't really modeled on a real-world amplifier, or if they are, I don't think that they were intending you to be able to pick out what those are, and they use these very interesting adjectives to describe the saturation and distortion, which I think is really cool and shows you how the plugin domain, the software domain, you can think about these things a little bit differently. You don't have to be stuck in the past always thinking, okay, I'm overdriving this circuit and this is what happens with amplifier TX759, whatever. You don't have to think that way inside of the computer, which is great. How hard you push things, whether that's on the input or with a dedicated distortion knob, will determine the level of saturation and distortion, and it's up to you to then set that to taste. In this case, always preface the main concept and sound over the technical definition. It's about you creating that link. When you create that link with this plugin to this effect, you're in really good shape. That's when you start to know that you actually know what you're doing, as compared to regurgitating or arguing somebody else's point that you've read on a forum. That's not what this is about. This is about finding those classifications and definitions that really work for you as a unique artist and individual. And next week, we'll be back with the same general idea, but in a couple of different ways. We'll be looking at other major contributions and components that factor into the color and character of really any plugin. Not just those that are analog modeled, but every single plugin has a couple of other unique features and characteristics that will help you understand what device to choose when you're looking for a particular color or character. So thanks a lot for your attention, and until next week, I hope you enjoy working with the virtual overdrive.